Hello, everyone, and welcome to Real World Reading, a live discussion between Kathy Seigel, head teacher of Maysbrook Park School in Dagenham, and me. Just apologies for our late start. We had a few technical difficulties, but we're back on. If there's any technical glitch, rest assured we'll come back into the meeting. So apologies to keep you waiting a few minutes, but we're really excited to be here with all of you today. So if you've been to one of our webinars before, welcome. It's great to have you back. And if it's your first time, welcome. It's great to have you here. So I'm Matt Balsica, part of the membership engagement team at The Day. We've hosted plenty of webinars in the past couple of years, but this time around, we're refreshing our format slightly. So rather than a set agenda within the 30 minutes we have today, I'll be asking Kathy some questions to dive into what you really want to know about getting disengaged students reading. If time allows, we'll try and squeeze in a couple of audience questions. So if you have anything that you'd like to ask Kathy, just put it into the chat and we'll do our best to fit them in at the end of the session. So Kathy, a warm welcome. Thank you for being here. And really just to start us off, I'd like to start by asking you, can you tell us a bit about your background and the students you work with at Maysbrook Park School?
Yeah, hello everybody. I have worked in education for over 35 years. I have a family background in education, so my mother, my grandmother, and other people who all worked in education. Very boring, but it gives me a much better grounding. I worked initially in Hackney and spent a lot of time working with disengaged young people in the late 80s, early 90s and on. And so really that gave me a good grounding for where I am now. After working in mainstream for over 20 years, I then accidentally fell into alternative provision and ended up here at Maysbrook Park School. And I have to say, I think this is probably the most rewarding job that I've ever had. Hardest, but most rewarding. We work with children who are permanently excluded from school, secondary age students. We work with young people who come to us via the fair access process. So they've had to come into the borough and they've not been able to go to a mainstream setting. And we also have, I don't like to describe it like this, but it's accurate. We have the young people that nobody really else knows what to do with. And so we just scoop them all up and do what we can. Um, yeah, so it's a very strange place to work, but it's absolutely lovely. We have children that have high levels of criminality, next to children who have experienced bullying, all sorts of things. So it's a very mixed bag in comparison to mainstream settings.
Absolutely. And, just that phrase permanently excluded really drives home the importance of what you're doing, Kathy, because you're reaching some of the most unreachable learners and doing really good stuff with them. And with that said, just to kind of dive into the reading aspect of that, like what are some of the common barriers to reading that you see with this cohort of students, and how does the reading ability kind of vary across the cohort?
So, unfortunately, a lot of the children that come to us have got very, very low levels of literacy, and they haven't enjoyed, if I just use the term English, when they've been in their mainstream setting for whatever reason. That could be that they weren't read to as children, or they struggled because they've got undiagnosed needs, and lots of our children do have undiagnosed needs. Um, and and their needs haven't been met. And I'm sure that's not because our mainstream colleagues haven't tried. It's just that with all of the other complications around them, it means that they come with barriers that have been really insurmountable in a mainstream setting. We're very lucky. We have a small school with high levels of staffing, small classes, which means we can give a really bespoke offer to those children. And we can be really creative and innovative in what we do around reading and other bits and pieces.
That's great. And maybe some of those innovations, we could kind of discuss, because I think a lot of the audience typically coming here for sort of that expertise of takeaways. Is there anything that kind of stands out that helps sort of in your work in engaging students in reading? Again, with what I assume just a wide variety of reading levels, and maybe
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we
yeah,
have some pre-readers. And you'd have thought this is secondary. We shouldn't have pre-readers, but we do have some pre-readers. We
yeah.
have some who cannot access what would normally be considered in line with their chronological age. Often you'll get children whose reading age is below their chronological, but for some of us, it is many, many years below their chronological age. So there's a real difference. And then we've got those who are really high flyers as well, who aren't being challenged, and therefore they mess around and they get kicked out for that. So it can be difficult. And we do try and ensure that our student groups are very small, so that way their teachers can adapt what they're doing within the one group, or we have additional support staff that can then support the children as well. Some of the more interesting and creative things that we've done, apart from the fact that we have a reading slot on our timetable, so there is an expectation that any of our children will read at some point during the week in a group setting. They can't escape it. They haven't got a choice. And we then use different texts. We will use newspapers. We'll use The Day. We'll use magazines. We'll use something that will grab their attention. I've got one of my colleagues who uses this regularly to write for me, and she actually said that they deliberately choose articles that have got controversial headings because that engages the children and it allows them to get more into the discussion work around it and improve their oracy, and anything that will allow them to probe into those stories, but also do it in a safe setting. And so that's really important. We've got another child who has now chosen to read out loud to the class regularly because we're letting him use the visualizer. So he volunteers to read all the time because he likes playing with the visualizer and getting it up on the screen, but he's reading while he's doing that, and the other children are following his reading out loud. So he would never have done that a few months ago, which is great. And again, another one, he came, absolutely hated reading, hated writing, anything to do with literacy at all, wasn't going to do it. By the time he left us and moved on to his new school, he was standing at the front. He was leading those reading sessions with his class. He was encouraging them to read to each other, reading out loud, and actually taking a responsible role in the classroom. So it's just about tapping into their interests, really.
These are really great examples. And there's something that always comes out when we talk about reading. It's this idea of how reading aloud, whether it's by the teacher, led by the student, how that changes everything. Because what you've just highlighted is how it creates that agency within, for example, the second example of that student to really take the reins. And I think reading can be obviously seen as something quite solitary, passive, but when you do it in that way, it lights up, a group of
Yeah.
students.
I mean, we've done other things as well, because obviously we have to look at both sides of reading. We're also talking about the oracy. We're talking about the writing element of it, and so we've also encouraged our children to use spoken word and to write clean grime. I know that sounds weird, but for our kids, it taps into their interests. So they've written clean grime. We had another child who the English teacher for his Romeo and Juliet asked him to write a rap to describe the main characters. So he wrote a rap, and he came and performed that rap to me so that he was able to remember who the different characters were and something about each of those characters, but in a rap. And that allowed him to, he had to write it, he had to read it, he had to perform it. So it's that innovative approach to trying to get them involved as much as possible.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. With music, rap, like that's gonna be memorable for students. And
Yeah.
I really enjoyed hearing the cross section of reading materials you use, whether it's magazines, newspapers, The Day, because I mean, reading is sort of competing against how interesting the internet can be for students with social media and everything that's provocative on there. So how does reading stay as exciting as maybe spending time kind of scrolling through social media? So it's hard work to find
Challenge.
something
Yeah.
interesting.
It is a challenge, but I think that giving the children opportunities to bring the topics to us. So because we've got a timetabled slot, we also do, like many schools do, we will have each of our tutor groups have a book that they're reading together. So some of the focus will be on the book that they're reading together, and they'll take opportunities to read each, and the teacher might read, the children might read, but also that reading slot for me is not set in stone as to what we're reading.
Mm.
Yes, it's good that we're reading something continuously and we're going through a story, but also if they've got a topic that they want to address, then we can go sort of off topic onto a new topic which suits them. And again, using any media that there is out there that will allow us to get them reading. I don't mind as long as they're reading. I prefer them to be reading some of the set text, but for some of our children, as soon as you give them a set text, they're switched off. So we have to
Mm.
try and find a way to get them reading and then use praise, reward, etc. around the skills that they've learned over a period of time. We will revisit where they were at the beginning of a period of time and then where they are later on and how much they've improved. Again, as I said, the children that weren't reading when they first came out loud, what they now do, they're really proud of themselves.
Yeah.
And that's a massive thing for some of our children. Yes, I can just see someone in the chat, graphic novels, we use those too. As I said, anything at all that we can pick up that will allow them to be engaged.
Absolutely. And I think, the key word here is the flexibility you have around reading is everything, because it's showing the students that we can attack this in so many different ways, and it doesn't matter the way we do it, but it can be interesting. And I think what's interesting about reading too for students is one week someone doesn't feel like a reader, but just by doing some of the things you've mentioned already, Kathy, it can change that mindset, from one week to another, that now I am a reader because I feel that sort of agency over what I'm doing. So that's really helpful. Kind of speaking about reading in particular, do you think, for example, nonfiction has a unique role to play for students who don't see themselves as
Definitely,
readers?
definitely. And
Yeah.
I think I'm sure that my colleagues on the call will recognize this, that in particular boys um, don't like fiction, they like real life. And that's where I talked about perhaps using magazines. It could be that they're reading articles around motorbikes if that's what they're interested in. It could be that they are looking at just an article in a paper, even the back pages, the sport pages, anything that's going to get them recognizing that how they can access that piece of writing. I'm sure all the people on the call have used highlighters. They'll have used text that they've cut up into different sections and placed those words back in different order, got the kids to then write things in a different way, backwards and forwards. There's a whole load of things that we do that are a little bit more involved rather than just physically picking up a pen and writing or just picking up a book and reading. They've actually got to get a pair of scissors, cut an article up. You have those sentences, I'll have those sentences. How do we make a whole article out of these sentences? Just something that just makes it a bit more interesting. And
Yeah.
again, non-fiction works really, really well for that.
And like with nonfiction, when you're maybe talking with your students about things that are happening in the world, so current affairs, is there any particular topic or theme within current affairs that's really resonating with students right now that's a go-to kind of reading point for them?
I don't think so, because I mean, the particular students that we work with, current affairs doesn't really mean much to them. I mean, we've all been teenagers at some point in our lives. I Thinking back, it was a while ago, but I don't remember really being that involved. I had a little bit of time pre-teen and a little bit at the end of my teenage years where suddenly the news became more interesting. That middle slot where we're in secondary key stage 3 and early key stage 4, it's not necessarily something that interested in, but it's important for us as part of our wider school curriculum to encourage them to be involved in current affairs. So and I think it lends itself, the day lends itself to that. Some of the articles in there, some of those little video clips, some of the bits and pieces that you've got there that stretches the boundaries of reading,
Yeah,
draws them also into those current affairs as well.
yeah. And then in terms of back to nonfiction and how it resonates with boys and how fiction is a tougher sell for boys. Is there something really specific about fiction that puts boys off from your experience, and is that
If
something that can be
if they
overcome, or
don't,
is it just the way it
yeah,
is?
no, I think it's if they don't find it relevant to their world.
Okay.
And I think that some of the set texts that we have to study, although we've got lots over time that have tried to tap into the teenage boys in particular, I think that you're sometimes better finding shorter stories, or maybe using the graphic novels, or in particular at the moment, if you think comics are really big, with all
Yeah,
the Guardians of the Galaxy, etc., Spider-Man, Superman, all those things, whatever you can do to draw them in, and then pick out from that, well, how might you write that if you were writing it in a different way? How might, if you didn't use pictures, how might you tell that story? Or vice versa. If you've got a
yeah,
story and a text, how do you make that into a cartoon? How do you do a strip feature instead? So again, just getting them to analyze the text and use it differently.
yeah.
And I've just seen again on the chat, the sports are really good. As I said, back pages of the papers, bring in an article, even going onto the news websites, getting them to read the bits off the news websites.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were sharing some stories about students and some of the success you've had. Are there any, again, staying with nonfiction, do you have any particular kind of stories about things that have worked with nonfiction and students that you remember that are memorable that we could share out maybe, or how nonfiction's had an impact with a
Yeah,
particular student?
I think that if it's something, as I said, that's a genre that they're interested in, so it could be that I don't know, I'm going to use Stormzy as an example because most of us would recognise that name. But if there were a news article about Stormzy, for example, that's a really good buy-in because they're using their understanding and their knowledge of a music artist, but they're also reading about that music artist. So it's a crossover, and you can use that as the cross-curricular element as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then kind of branching out on the other skills that come out of reading when students start reading, have you seen any things like critical thinking, or I mean, you've talked about the oracy bit you've talked about, but any increases in critical thinking once students start reading a little bit more, or changes in sort of those skill
Yeah, so
sets?
so we moved away, and I don't know of other schools that are doing this, but there probably are. We moved away from having learning objectives, and we have learning questions. So instead of having a learning objective at the beginning of our lesson, we've got a learning question. And so we start the lesson with that question, and hopefully by the end of that lesson, they're able to answer that question. And through the use of that question and trying to find the answer, they've got to do that critical thinking. And that could
Okay.
then be that it'd be part of an English lesson. This is your question. We've now got to find the answer to that question through the work that we're doing. So I think
Yeah.
that lends itself far more than the traditional learning objective, and it encourages that critical thinking throughout.
Yeah. That's a really great way to start the thinking out. Pose it as a question rather than something to do on a
Yeah,
list, because that always feels like a chore when we're students, and we get
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
Even for adults. And then kind of some other things to think through in terms of reading. Um, we talked about current affairs and not really mattering sort of particularly at that age group. But with some advice to the teachers trying to engage their students in similar contexts, because we have a wide swath of teachers here from different types of schools. What's just adding to the list of takeaways you've already given us, Kathy, what's one small change that you can do in a reader's life or a student's life that can make a big difference in what you see come out, of their sort of reading, just in general in school? Is there anything you could share with the
That's
audience?
a really hard question to answer because there are so many different ways to encourage children to read, and so one thing isn't necessarily gonna hit it for everybody. Um,
Yeah,
but I would recommend trying to be as creative as possible and ask them for their ideas because
yeah,
we're adults. What do we know? It's a long time since, for me anyway, a long time since I was a teenager. The expectation when I was at school about reading was we basically all did it and that was it because it was a long time ago. Now they've got so many different opportunities to read. They've got their phones, they've got tablets, they've got laptops, they've got screens. And also, what are they reading? So finding out what it is they're reading. Are they reading? If they're not reading, what might they want to read? So again,
yeah,
it's all about student voice and getting them to help us to make the curriculum more accessible to them, but also getting the right resources. And I think that schools' budgets are very, very tight. So sometimes it's really hard for teachers to ask their schools if they're going to fund something else. So um, any method of getting free resources, grab it with both hands. Find out if there are people. I mean, I bring in my husband has a subscription to Auto Express. When he's read it, I bring all the magazines in. I've got
Nice.
Cosmo, anything that to get people to bring those in. I've mentioned previously when we've spoken in the past, Matt, about we used to get the Metro free newspaper. We would bring that
Yeah.
in. We'd have that lying around at break time, lunchtime. We'd encourage the kids to just sit, have a little look at the paper, so they constantly don't realise that this reading is happening in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, those are all, those are three different types of periodicals, but they're all interesting in their own regard. And it's just getting them, getting it in front of students. But the Metro never fails to kind of entertain. And I think that's the whole point. It's meant to capture
And that's the whole
the
point. Yeah,
commuter.
it's short, punchy, but it's also it bridges that gap between child and adult.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, those are great. We're moving so quickly through this. I want to get to some of the great questions from the audience that are already coming through. This one's actually from Emily in the audience. I'll put it to you, Kathy. How did you get staff buy-in and feel confident enough to plan your own reading sessions, especially if they're not English teachers? So that's a question about how to get kind of other teachers you work with on board.
Yeah.
Um, with reading.
So because of the low levels of literacy, I employ a primary teacher in a secondary
Okay.
setting.
Okay.
And she's got that skill set and that expertise around teaching early readers. And so she's done training sessions with staff around how she, as a primary teacher, was trained to do reading with the children. And we use a lot of those skills across the whole school. And because uh, as I said, I'm a bully. No, I'm not really, but I've got a timetabled session where they have to do reading. It's
Yeah.
really important that the children see adults reading. So I think sometimes an adult just reading at the front of the room, reading out loud to the kids, the same sort of thing that you might have got in a primary setting with the teacher reading the story to the children. Most of our adults are comfortable if they're reading a little story to the kids. And
Yeah.
that was the quickest shoe-in for those staff. And then once they realised that the kids were starting to enjoy it and doing that backwards and forwards between the kids reading a paragraph, then reading a paragraph, it starts to become the norm. So that bit wasn't too scary. Planning those sessions, well, we have that centrally done. We have one of our senior leadership. She provides a scaffold for our teachers for each week when those reading sessions. So there
Okay.
are particular articles and things that they might have to read, or there might be a topic or a theme that they have to read. But that is led by it's actually led by one of our Senkos.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, sometimes these takeaways that are really memorable are the ones that are the most obvious. Just having every day that allotted time. I keep coming back to what you just mentioned it again, but you mentioned it at the top of the chat, this idea that you set the intention, you're flexible how you do it, but it happens. And it
Yeah.
happens in a way that has the students buy in.
And
What do you
when we first did that, they
Yeah.
were really reluctant. I mean, really
Okay.
reluctant. It was like, we're going to go anywhere but into that classroom to do that reading. But
Hmm.
now the ethos and the culture is set. There's an expectation. The children know that they're going to do it, whether they like it or not. And now, actually, as I said, they all quite enjoy it
Yeah,
because
perfect. What a
it's a group
transformation.
activity. There's an adult that's leading it. It tends to be a quite light-hearted, but it is still an activity that feeds into their wider school work.
That's wonderful. No, that's really good. And on that kind of note, as we're sort of coming to the end of our half hour, what keeps you optimistic in the line of work that you do, Kathy, and the students you work with? Because you've seen it all. You've shown,
I have, yeah, unfortunately. Um, every day, I mean, we all know in schools every day is different. I mean, but the challenge in a pupil referral unit or in alternative provision is that you have a constant flow of children. There is high levels of pupil mobility.
yeah,
So you genuinely have to keep that motivation there, and you have to be prepared for whatever's coming through the door next. Um, and the best part is really seeing that change in those children every single day. And because we're working with smaller numbers, you can really see the incremental change um, for those children over sometimes a very short period of time.
Yeah, that's it. Just seeing the change that keeps you going day in and
Yeah.
day out because it's coming in small ways and different ways every day that you kind of engage with this. So, that's really good. We're sort of at the end of our half hour, but what I'd like to do, you've given us so much, Kathy. Are there any parting thoughts that we could leave the audience with? And by the way, thanks for all these great questions that have helped
Yeah, and,
stimulate
and
this
I'm more than
conversation.
happy to answer those questions outside of the meeting if people genuinely
Oh,
want answers to them. Um, I mean, for me, the bit is that we can't access any of the curriculum if we can't read. That's the
yeah,
most important thing. So whatever methods we have to use to get those children engaged in reading, we do that, and then we build on that and build on that and build on that. And then at the end of their educational career, which never really ends, if we remember, school goes on for the rest of your life. Just having them so that they're happy to read is the most important thing for me.
perfect. That's a really good place to leave this. And I really appreciate all of that info. So I think that's all we have a time for in today's session. Again, to our audience, thanks for holding on for us for a few minutes while we got started. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. If you've enjoyed this format, kind of fast and furious, right in the middle of the day, and like to attend more, just please leave us some feedback in the survey. That will pop up when the webinar ends in a second. A huge thank you, Kathy. You've
You're
been so
welcome.
interesting for being our first guest in this new format and for being such a knowledgeable panelist. We'll be sending around to everyone a PDF of some of the practical tips shared by Kathy today in an email tomorrow, as well as the recording of this session if you'd like to rewatch in your own time or share with your peers at school. If you'd like to learn more about the day, I have to say, in the literacy tools we offer to boost reading engagement, please do get in touch with me. My colleague will post a form in the chat now where you can book a call with our team. We can also tell you more about our spring offer that we're running until the end of this month. So thank you again, Kathy, and thanks for offering yourself to any audience member who might have questions offline. That's very generous of you. Just to let you know, our next webinar will be after the Easter break, so we'll see you there. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.